Good afternoon. Welcome to the lecture on Ives Concord Sonata. Born in Danbury, Connecticut in 1874, the paradoxes that would mark Charles Ives' life were apparent from the beginning. The Iveses were an extended family in Danbury, most of the members of which were especially prominent in business. Ives' father, on the other hand, was something of the black sheep of the family, owing to his selection of music as his career. George Ives was versatile on many different instruments, but most especially on the cornet, and had some basic theatrical training from a German immigrant in New York. George Ives was a band master during the Civil War, and afterwards returned home and continued with various musical occupations. According to Charles Ives, his own earliest exposure to extended musical techniques and ideas that would later inform his music originated from his father. For example, Ives remembered that his father would sometimes have him sing a Stephen Foster song in one key while accompanying in another. Most famously, he remembered his father arranging two bands marching from the opposite ends of the town, and the fascinating crash of sound that arose from this collision. George Ives died suddenly of a stroke soon after Charles began at Yale, and the sudden loss of his father and his memories of growing up were to be powerful influences in his later life and work. Ives was musically precocious, and by the time he was 14, he was the youngest organist in the state, and continued as one until well after he finished at Yale. He was an accomplished virtuoso on the organ. By his late teens, as he extended musical work, Variations on America demonstrates. Another major influence in Ives' musical career was Horatio Parker, with whom Ives studied during his time at Yale. Although Ives later largely discounted Parker's influence, it seems certain that much of his concrete musical ability with counterpoint and large-scale forms were doubtlessly learned from Parker. According to Ives' later recollections, he began to feel constricted by Parker's musical conservatism and his lack of understanding of Ives' musical eccentricities after a few years. Nonetheless, he continued attempting to write music in the conventional late Romantic style in an attempt to have some public success as a composer. After the lukewarm response to his cantata, The Celestial Country, Ives gave up his last post as an organist and devoted his days to his work in insurance business and his nights and weekends to writing the music that he heard in heart. At this point, he began to experiment freely without worrying about whether his works would please an audience or not. Ives began remarkably successful in the insurance business and ended up writing one of the classic pamphlets on the proper techniques of estate planning. The third major influence on Ives' work and life, as stated by himself, was his wife, Harmony Ives. They corresponded and met on and off for several years before they were finally married in 1908. Harmony had a profound influence on Ives' philosophy, as can be clearly seen from this quotation she wrote to Ives in a letter from early 1908. She said, "I think inspiration in art seems to be a consolation in hours of sadness or loneliness, and that most happy moments are put into expression after they have been memories, and make doubly precious because they are gone. This idea of music as helping to crystallize life moments in memory became a major theme in Ives' later work. Harmony also showed great interest in Ives' family history, and in particular about his father, and also had a binding love for great literature. Her interest in those areas helped to encourage Ives to compose works that echo memories of his father and his childhood, as well as works inspired by literature. Pieces like The 4th of July, the Third Symphony, and of course the Concord Sonata that you'll be hearing today, all are some examples of the master works that Ives come up with based on these ideas. After the intense compositional activity of these years, Ives was largely distracted from the composition during the First World War. During his long recovery after a heart attack suffered in 1918, after a speech given at a meeting about Liberty Bonds, he seems to have become very aware of his mortality and began compiling and revising the works that he had written in the previous decades and a half. The Concord Sonata and the accompanying book, Essays Before a Sonata, came first in 1919, followed by the 114 songs, the Fourth Symphony, and many others of his mature works. Ives began very few absolutely new works at this time, and one day in 1927, as Harmony remembered, he came downstairs one day with tears in his eyes and said he couldn't seem to compose anymore. Nothing went well, nothing sounded right. In the 30s, 40s, and 50s, Ives' music began to amass a following of famous musicians. Henry Cowell, John Kirkpatrick, and Bernstein were some of the great artists who championed Ives' music, which finally received the performances and the praise that had been absent for decades. Ives continued to revise and tinker with his earlier compositions right up to the end of his life, with the final version of the Concord Sonata published only in 1947. He also recorded some of his own piano playing and singing as well. The Concord Sonata began life as sketches from an Emerson overture for piano and orchestra, but was later expanded as a solo sonata to encompass 4 sketches of important figures from the Concord, Massachusetts during the mid-1800s, which happened to correspond to the years of his father's boyhood. Accompanied by a very long and complicated set of essays that painstakingly, and sometimes confusingly, set forth Ives' view on aesthetics and music, including Ives' major concern of substance versus manner, substance more or less the spiritual content of the work, and manner is the mean of the expression. The essay and the sonata, taken as a whole, is probably Ives' most complete expression of his personal philosophy. Here is the dedication of the book. These prefatory essays were written by the composer for those who can't stand his music, and the music for those who can't stand his essays. To those who can't stand either, the whole is respectfully dedicated. First movement. In Emerson, Ives paints a picture of an idealized Emerson as he conceived him, as an everyday prophet, striding into the unknown world of the spirit and handing back his message of commonplace divinity to his audience. Emerson emphasized idea of intellectual self-reliance and first-hand natural inspiration. In his first important essay, Nature, these views are most clearly and concisely stated. Very good. Last one. In a way, this exalted view of Emerson, most clearly expressed in Ives' idealism and evoked memory of his father. All of these ideas found a musical equivalent in the quotation from the Beethoven Fifth Symphony that Ives used as a major musical building block. Characterized by Ives himself as an oracle, this theme represented the striving after truth that was the most important part of Emerson's work for Ives. The music itself, although bearing some surface remembrance to classical sonata forms by Mozart and Beethoven, as well as later sonatas by Franz Liszt, is also designed to mirror the complexity and transcendent quality of Emerson's prose and the tendon beauty and simplicity of his poetry. Ives mark alternating sections of music, prose, and poetry, and the difference is clearly audible. The prose section being highly dissonant and going in many different directions, and the poetry sections being more calm, consolate, and melodically clear. Second movement, Nathaniel Hawthorne. The choice of Nathaniel Hawthorne as the subject of the second movement was an interesting choice for a sonata that focuses on major transcendentalist figure. Hawthorne himself was frequently severely critical of the idea expressed by the transcendentalist as being confused and absurdly idealistic. In the story, The Celestial Railroad, which Ives cited as an inspiration for this movement, the figure of giant transcendentalism appears at one point, shouting with great vigor at the train's passengers, although none of them could understand his confusing statements. Hawthorne's dark, pessimistic view of human nature expressed in the work like The Scarlet Letter, dealing with the themes like sin and guilt, was not Ives' main focus for this movement. Instead, he used as his inspiration the fantastic side of Hawthorne, as expressed in the stories like those in the Tanglewood Tales, The Wonder Book for Children, and The Celestial Railroad. The Celestial Railroad is a dream sequence in which the narrator is a passenger on a train, supposedly going to heaven. The narrator's guide, Mr. Smooth-It-Away, the devil in disguise, is showing the narrator all of the modern conveniences of traveling by train rather than traveling the hard way on foot to reach the celestial city. At the end, the narrator awakes with a start, just realized that the true identity of the devil. The music starts out with a ghostly, dreamlike atmosphere, with bits of popular melody, ragtime, and fiddle tunes emerging from the texture, as if they're the entertainment on the train. There are sections with hymn-like melodies, including one where a bell-like effect is made with a wooden board played gently on the black keys. I'm going to show you my board. And also make sure it's there. Yeah. So here we go. The hymn used here, Jesus, Lover of My Soul, is very similar to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony theme. I'm gonna just try to sing it. Jesus, lover of my soul, let me to thee blossom fly. I changed the melody. Okay. Thanks. Where am I? Okay. There are also frequent effects that remind of train noises. Later, there is an explosive brass band section recalling the band performances that his father directed in Ives' youth. The band gets faster and faster and falls apart several times along the way. In the final section of the piece, of this movement, Ives combines several patriotic tunes in a free variation fantasia, including Colombian, Gem of the Ocean, and his own song, They Are There, which Ives unforgettably recorded toward the end of his life. I'm going to play you his own singing. And A. After a wild coda, which combines all of these ideas with the Beethoven motif and the hymn, and the movement ends abruptly, the narrator awakened from his dream in Hawthorne's story. Oh, that's the They Are There. Okay. In the Alcotts movement, Ives stated that he was not trying to paint any of Bronson Alcott's philosophy. Instead, he wanted to picture the Alcotts family life, the family that did much with little and faced up to hardship with hope and faith. Ives seemed to feel that this family represented for him the ideals of the universal human spirit. In particular, the wistful, nostalgic atmosphere may have as much to do with the literature work of the most famous member of the family, Louisa May Alcott, the Little Women. Louisa May's most famous work, Little Women, which follows the lives of 4 sisters, is based on an idealized picture of her own family. At the end of this movement comes the fullest realization of the main musical theme of the whole Concord Sonata, the theme that Ives called the human faith motif. Based on a combination of hymn tune and Beethoven's theme, this motif appears in only fragments on other movements, but is completely stated only here in this movement. Thoreau, the subject of the final movement of the sonata, is perhaps the figure who is closest to Ives' heart. Thoreau was one of Ives' earliest interests among the transcendentalist philosophers, and the one who helped him through what he called one low day when the sun had gone down long, long before sunset, the day his father died. This movement was also adapted into a song by Ives with text paraphrased from Thoreau, which perfectly reflects the quiet solitude painted so eloquently by Thoreau in many passages in his most famous book, Walden. And I'm going to play you the song.
His meditations are interrupted only by the faint sound of the conquered bell, a melody, as it were, imported into the wilderness. At a distance over the woods, the sound acquires a certain migratory hum, as did the pine needles in the horizon, or the strings of a harp which it swept. A vibration of the universal glad, just as the intrigue atmosphere makes a distant vision of earth interesting to the eye, by the azure tint it imparts.
This movement may also have represented something of a personal memorial of his father is suggested by the references of Stephen Foster's song, Masses in the Cold Ground. Maybe I should play the melody. Recognize when it comes. And Ives' own song, Remembrance, my father's song. This is an important song I'm going to play for you. The direction for the flute part near the end recalls Thoreau's habit of playing his flute on the water of Walden Pond, and also recalls of the family history of one of his father's first instrument. The last time we hear the faint suggestion of Beethoven's fifth quotation is different and is transcended into his father's song motif. If you notice at the end, instead of it's gonna go and that is his father's song. The Concord Sonata ends with an unanswered question. Conclusion. The Concord Sonata, which perfectly reflects the most important aspect of Ives' life, also reaches out beyond the personal into the universal humankind's longing for truth and meaning of existence. Now you'll be hearing the Concord Sonata.